Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this launch of Poverty in Wales 2025. We're delighted to be with you, and thanks so much for joining us. I'm just going to give you a quick introduction before we get onto the main part of the webinar today. Just so you know, the session is a webinar, so if you're watching, your cameras and mics are already switched off. You don't have to worry about that. And you'll see down at the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A function which is available for you to type in any questions that you have for us as we go along. If you've got kind of technical questions about methodology, the analysts who produced the report will try and answer those as we go along. But we will have a section at the end, about 25 minutes, where there'll be a chance to ask the JRF team who produced the report, along with our colleagues in the Bevan Foundation, Victoria and Stefan, any questions that you have. And if you see somebody else asking a question that you like, you can upvote a particular question. That just makes it a bit more likely that we'll be able to get to your question as we go along, because we expect quite a few. So we may struggle to get through them all, but we will certainly do our best. So in today's webinar, you're going to hear from the important people who produced this report, our analysts Taha, Scott and Fran. They'll take you through the main findings of the report. Then have a chance to hear from Victoria at Bevan with some quick reflections from her on what we think the report is telling us. And then we'll have, as I say, 20 to 25 minutes at the end for people to ask us any questions. I'm not going to kind of pre-announce what is in the report, but I think with poverty deepening in Wales, as it is elsewhere in the UK, it has to be said, but also with the prospect of, almost 1 in 3 children in Wales living in poverty, we really hope that this report can serve as a bit of a wake-up call, to all the parties who are looking to stand in next year's Senate elections, and to both the Welsh and UK government, that this level of poverty cannot be acceptable anywhere, and it's incumbent on anyone who has the power to do so to make a difference. So what I'm going to do now is hand over to Taha to let him, with his colleagues, take you through some of the main findings of what we hope is an important report.
Thank you very much, Chris. If I turn my video on. Yes, great. Hello, everyone. Thanks for attending today's webinar. I'm Taha Bakari, a lead analyst at JRF, and I've led the analysis for poverty in Wales alongside my colleague Scott Hunter and Francisca Ladouche. Next slide, please. Before we start, kind of a little bit about us. The Joseph Rowntree Foundation is an independent social change organisation working to support and speed up the transition to a more equitable and just future free from poverty. Poverty in Wales is a sister publication to our annual UK poverty report, and it's produced every 3 to 5 years, working very closely with our partner colleagues, the Bevan Foundation. This publication looks across a range of data sources, mainly the DWP's households below average income dataset, but also published insights from the public and third sector to build up a comprehensive picture of the current state of poverty in Wales. Next slide, please. Let's define poverty. And obviously the term poverty features a lot in media. Child poverty in particular has been in the news a lot recently. Sometimes those terms are a bit abstract and not explained properly, or at least in human terms. So a slide here that just gives you a sense of what living in poverty actually means. Not being able to heat up your home, pay your rent, waking up every day with kind of facing insecurity and making impossible decisions about money, not being able to participate fully in society, and facing marginalization because of your financial circumstances. And we have a section today where we'll speak to some of these experiences too. Next slide, please. In terms of some of the more quantitative definitions of poverty that we use in this report, relative income poverty is our usual measure. We calculate it after housing costs, where households have less than 60% of the current contemporary median income. We also use deep and very deep poverty, which is defined as less than 50% or less than 40% of contemporary median income, respectively. And we also make mention in the report of destitution, which is the most severe form of hardship, where you can't afford basics such as shelter, heating, or clothing. Just a couple of notes. When we talk about household income, we are adjusting for household size and composition. So a family of 4, 2 children, 2 adults will have their income adjusted to kind of mirror what a single person living on their own would have. And we include all sources of income, including savings, pensions, benefits, and interest on savings. Most of the measures that we speak to use a long-standing DWP survey, the HBIA dataset, and that averages about 20,000 households across the UK and between 800 to 1,000 households in Wales. And to continue turning my audience off, a methodological point, we've used, due to those low sample sizes, the kind of 800 to 1,000 households in Wales, each year in the DWP survey, the HBIA survey, we use rolling averages of the last 3 years of data to produce statistics for Wales. This is to avoid kind of volatility in the findings and smooth out some of the year-on-year variances in the sample. We also sometimes use 5 or 7 year averages, and where we do that in the report, we have explicitly noted it. So do look out for that. In terms of the actual data set, the HBIA data set, we've used data up to 2022 and 23, and there's still a little bit of a COVID-19 effect on data collection in terms of online and face-to-face, but methods have online interviews and face-to-face interviews, but methods have gradually returned to their pre-pandemic modes. I made reference to using 2022-23 data set there. The latest year's data and any revisions in the 2023-24 data came out as we were heading to publishers. So they are only featured in our in the main report in the overall poverty section. So on to the actual substantive findings. The headline statistic is that more than 1 in 5 people in Wales were in poverty in the latest data. That breaks down to about 700,000 people in Wales. Specifically, that's 22% of the population, including 200,000 children. That's just over 3 in 10 children. 400,000 working age adults, the equivalent of 1 in 5 working age adults, and 100,000 pensioners, about 16% of pensioners. And in common with most of the other nations of the UK, there's been no marked progress over the last 20 years in reducing poverty in Wales. The overall poverty rate is higher in Wales than in the other UK nations. Next slide, please. Rates, as you can see, have consistently hovered around 21 to 22% in the last 20 years, roughly from where that 2003 to 2006 tick starts. And there has been a bit of a convergence with England in the kind of the latest data. A lack of progress, you can kind of see that. It's 22% in 2003 to 2006, and it's 22%, 23% in the latest data. Chris alluded to it at the start of this session, but poverty is deepening in Wales. Next slide, please. Levels of poverty, as I've mentioned, have sorry, backward a bit. Thank you. Levels of poverty across Wales have changed little, as that previous graph just showed. But if we go on to the next slide, looking at overall levels of poverty hides the fact that poverty has actually been deepening over that period. To look at that deepening, we split the group of 700,000 people in poverty into 3 groups based on their income. And I kind of defined this at the start. So it's people in very deep poverty, that dark blue segment at the bottom of the chart, who have an income of less than 40% of the UK median. These are the lowest income households, far below the poverty line. People in deep poverty, the kind of medium blue colour there, people in deep poverty but not very deep poverty, who are between the 40% and the 50% of median UK income. And people in poverty, but not deep poverty, who have an income of between 50 and 60% of the UK median. This is the group at the top of the chart who are the closest to the poverty line. But as you can see, those groups have changed over time. What we see is that group of people in very deep poverty have become the biggest of these three groups. So a greater proportion of the overall number of people in poverty have to support their households with the very lowest incomes, far below the poverty line. 30 years ago, people in very deep poverty made up about a third of people in poverty. Now, in the latest data that we use in the report, that's almost half. So that's 47% of people in poverty were living in very deep poverty. About to kind of take that a little bit further, 500,000 people in Wales are living in deep poverty, which is that line below 50%. So that those kind of deeper blue segments, that equates to about 450,000 people. Next slide, please. To kind of give you a sense of what the deepening and intensification of poverty means in cash terms, we can find an equivalent sort of pound amount for how much you need to kind of lift people above the poverty line. And so the financial gap between the median household income and the poverty line now it equates to £7,200. That's almost double the equivalent amount in 1994-97. And the size of the gap between the chart here shows the size of the gap between the median incomes of families in poverty and the relevant poverty line. So again, we can equate that to an average amount of money that would be needed to bring the incomes of families in those three groups to the kind of poverty line. That poverty gap for people in poverty stands at 30%. And in 1994-97, that was 24%. For a couple with two primary school age children, this equated to an inflation-adjusted shortfall of approximately £3,800 in 94-97. And that same couple 30 years later is the couple that needs £7,200 to be lifted just to the poverty line. The cash figure you need to get from that the deep blue line, the very deep poverty line, is almost double the £7,200. Again, in 94-97, that couple with two primary school age children that are in very deep poverty needed about £8,000 to be lifted to the poverty line. Today, this gap of 35% equates to about £13,500. These figures underscore just how far below the poverty line some families are and how much more support is needed for them to escape poverty altogether. I'll hand over to my colleague Scott now, who will talk about some of the groups that are experiencing poverty at high rates.
Yeah, thank you, Taha. So far we have looked at overall poverty rates, and while those figures are important, they only tell one part of the story. The reality is that these averages can mask deep inequalities. Certain groups in Wales face disproportionately high levels of poverty, often due to structural inequalities, discrimination, or systemic barriers. We're now going to shift the focus to speak about specific groups. Whether it's children, disabled people, or ethnic minorities, the burden of poverty falls far more heavily on some than others. This is important, as understanding these disparities is key to addressing them. So let's start with child poverty and family type. When we examine the types of families where child poverty is particularly high, a clear pattern emerges. Poverty tends to be significantly higher in households where childcare responsibilities limit parents or caregivers' ability to work. For instance, in families with 3 or more children, nearly 43% of children are living in poverty. A major factor is the inadequacy of the current benefit system, particularly the 2-child limit, which excludes third and subsequent children from receiving support. Additionally, childcare costs rise significantly with each extra child, making it increasingly difficult for parents to cover work-related expenses or even remain in the workforce. Next, we see a similar challenge in families with very young children, those under the age of 5. Here, about 45% of children are in poverty. These are typically preschool-age children, and the need for constant care often means one parent has to reduce their working hours or stay home entirely. Overall, this shows us that child poverty is closely linked to the structure and caregiving demands of the family, as well as the benefit system. Addressing these challenges means supporting families where the burden of care makes it hardest to stay afloat. Looking at other demographics, such as the ethnicity of the head of household, if you can go on to the next slide, please, thank you. This also shows us the types of families which are disproportionately impacted by poverty. This graph presents poverty rates in Wales by ethnicity, based on a 5-year average. The extended time frame is necessary due to very small sample sizes, which limit the reliability of year-by-year data for this current analysis. While 22% of people in white-headed households live in poverty, that figure jumps to 47% for ethnic minority-headed households, which is more than double. And among those in poverty, 58% of people in ethnic minority households are in very deep poverty, compared to 43% in white households. These disparities reflect the impact of racism, which are both direct and systemic, across areas like work, housing, and public services. The Welsh Government's anti-racist Wales Action Plan, which was updated in 2024, aims to tackle these inequalities, which is a positive move in the right direction. As Wales continues to become more ethnically diverse, addressing these injustices is essential to ending poverty for everyone. Looking at housing on the next slide, you can also see the high poverty rate for private and social renters. This highlights the role played by housing costs in pushing many people into poverty. The graph uses 2 colors to show how housing costs affect poverty. The blue bars represent people who were already living in poverty even before paying for housing. The green bars show people who weren't in poverty initially, but once housing costs are taken into account, they fall below the poverty line. In other words, blue shows how much of poverty is not driven by housing costs, while green highlights how housing costs alone can tip people over the edge. This distinction helps us see not just who is in poverty, but how housing plays a direct role in pushing people into hardship. So basically, the bigger the green bit, the higher the housing burden is on the poverty status of each of the groups. This report shows that the social rented sector tenants have the highest overall poverty rate, with a significant portion already in poverty before housing costs. Private renters also show a high poverty rate, with a notable increase after housing costs. Households buying with a mortgage or owning their home outright tend to have much lower poverty rates. However, it's important to note that this data is from 2022 and 23, and since then, mortgage costs have been rising due to the end of previously low interest rates. As a result, we may start to see an increase in poverty among mortgaged households, as higher monthly payments put more pressure on household budgets. But for some groups, like disabled working age adults, the barriers to escaping poverty go even deeper. Poverty for disabled people is often shaped by additional costs, limited access to suitable work, and systemic barriers. In our disability analysis, we use a poverty measure that excludes disability benefits, as these are meant to cover extra costs linked to disability, and including them can underestimate poverty risk. Our findings show that overall, disabled people in Wales face a poverty rate of 32%, compared to 22% for non-disabled people. Among working age adults, the gap is even wider, where 4 in 10, or 37% of disabled working age adults live in poverty, which is nearly the double the rate for those who are not disabled. It's also important to consider how poverty levels vary across different places in Wales. This map shows each local authority in Wales and is coloured based on the child poverty rate. The darker the shade, the higher the rate of child poverty in that area. You can see the highest child poverty rates in Blaenau Gwent, which has a child poverty rate of 34%, Merthyr Tydfil, Ceredigion, and Newport, which all have around 32% respectively. And the Isle of Anglesey and Pembrokeshire both have 31%. While we won't get into the specifics here, high child poverty rates are often driven by low wages, insecure work, and limited access to affordable childcare and employment. These challenges are also potentially worsened by rural isolation, urban deprivation, and long-term economic decline. In our analysis, we look into these factors in more detail and also see strong links between poverty, low employment rates, and local deprivation levels. Although some areas with high employment still face high poverty due to low-paid seasonal work. A more detailed analysis of these patterns is available in the full report. And just to note that there is more recent data that has been released since we've done this analysis, but unfortunately it kind of paints the same bleak picture of the extent of child poverty across the different areas in Wales. Not much improvement for the areas most affected. And overall, this leads us to a crucial point that work can reduce poverty, even if it doesn't eliminate it. While work can protect some people from poverty, it's not a guarantee. Only 11% of working age adults in employment are in poverty overall, but the risk is much higher for those in part-time or insecure jobs. Unemployment and economic inactivity carry the highest poverty risk at 42%, but even among workers, part-time employees face a poverty rate of 17%, more than double that of full-time workers at just 8%. This shows that work alone isn't always enough, and that job quality and job hours matter too. I'm now going to hand over to my colleague, Fran, who will talk about the experience of people in Wales who are in poverty.
Thanks, Scott. As my colleague just outlined, poverty doesn't impact everyone equally. Some groups are way more exposed than others, but beyond the statistics, they are real life. So now we're going to talk about the experience of people living in poverty. We can go to the next slide. Thank you. In Wales, people living in poverty experience worse health outcomes throughout their lives, and currently these gaps are widening. Life expectancy in the most deprived areas is over 6 years shorter for women and 7.5 years shorter for men, compared to the least deprived areas. But it's not just about living shorter lives, it's also about living fewer healthy years too. The healthy life expectancy gap is even wider, 13.4 years less for men and nearly 17 years less for women in the most deprived areas. Furthermore, as we can see in the chart, there are also differences in the life expectancy gap by age. People in poverty age between 35 to 49 and 50 to 64 years old are the two groups which have seen a reduction in the proportion of people living in less than good health, having an improvement of approximately 10 percentage points since 2012 to 2015. But when we look at those aged between 16 to 34 years old, we see an increase in the proportion living in less than good health, and they are now 30% more likely to live fewer healthy years than they were in 2012, 2015. This shows that the health inequality doesn't just persist, it is getting worse for some groups. We go to the next slide. In this slide, we can see that our next issue concerns the rising cost of living, which has significantly intensified the material hardship for many households in Wales. The Bevan Foundation has been tracking the impact of cost of living crisis on the Welsh population since December 2020. The latest data shows that between 2021 and 2024, the number of Welsh adults who said they couldn't afford the basics, even occasionally, nearly doubled, rising from 8% to 15%. And while there's been some improvement in most of the areas since summer 2023, the pressure on families is far from over. As we can see in the chart, food is the most commonly sacrificed essential. The latest data show that 23% of adults reduced their meal sizes or skip meals, and 14% of them had to do the same for their children. Other essential items that adults are going without include heating, clothing, and even hygiene products. Additionally, 13% of people couldn't afford essential journeys to go to work or to attend to medical appointments. We're going to the next slide. Thank you. As we have seen, food is the first thing that many people cut down, not for themselves, but also for their children. But beyond individual decision to skip meals lies a deeper and more persistent issue, food insecurity. This goes beyond occasional sacrifice and reflects a sustained inability to access sufficient nutrition food. Over the last few years, 1 in 5 people in poverty were food insecure, meaning they were either not able to afford enough food or could not afford enough nutrition food for a healthy diet. But that number rising significantly for certain groups. Nearly 1 in 4 children in poverty face food insecurity. And then, as we can see in the chart, when we compare by family type, people in poverty in lone parent family were most likely to experience food insecurity, with 44% of them being food insecure. Finally, among those receiving universal credit or legacy benefits, the food insecurity rate climbed to 35%, which is 6 times higher than for people in poverty but that not receive these benefits. This tells us once again that being in poverty doesn't affect everyone the same. Some people face much deeper hardships, and the UK benefit system is simply not providing a basic standard living for all. Finally, if we consider the financial resilience, which is a critical indicator for long-term economic stability, the latest data show that 72% of the lowest income households in Wales have no savings or have savings with less than £1,500. This means that they're highly exposed to even the smallest financial shocks. And then in the context of rising living costs, these households face increased difficulty managing essential outgoings and are far more likely to fall into debt. Between May 2021 and September 2024, the proportion of people borrowing money due to financial pressure increased from 17% to 30%. This means that nearly 1 in 3 households in Wales are borrowing money due to financial pressures. These figures underscore the growing fragility of households in Wales and highlight the urgent need for stronger financial protection and support mechanisms. I now hand it over back to Taha, who will speak to what needs to happen next, the political choices, priorities, and actions that are essential if we want to reverse this trend and deliver meaningful progress.
Thanks, both. What can be done, and I'm sure we'll get into it in the panel discussion too. And just to echo again Chris's comments at the start that the lack of progress on reducing poverty and the deepening and intensification of poverty is extremely worrying. Is 3 kind of cultural shifts that we think are necessary to kind of pivot away from our inaction or lack of progress. I kind of measured it around the start of this presentation. I talked about the amount of support someone who lives in deep poverty or very deep poverty needs to come to the poverty line, and as has been the case for many years now, this group has been negatively affected and disproportionately kind of faced disproportionate effects of political decisions and economic changes, and needs to feel some of the kind of political choices that will benefit them. There's also been quite a disappointing culture of low expectations of progress and kind of being okay with that. But concrete action and prioritization is critical. We've seen that a little bit in kind of the drumbeat of child poverty and the talk of the scourge of child poverty since the last election. But we need sort of concrete action to back up that discussion and talk. And again, we alluded to some of this in the presentation, but helping people find a secure job that sticks, improving financial protection for people if they lose their jobs or cannot work, and access to affordable, secure, decent homes are all things that will shift the dial on poverty. So we need to make some progress on that. Thank you all for listening, and look forward to the discussion. Pass it back over to Chris.
Thank you all for that. It's really helpful and hopefully gives everyone listening a bit of a taste of what's in the report. As my colleagues have been answering some of the questions in the chat, there is an awful lot of detail in the report behind some of the things which they covered. So if you can't find stuff in there, do drop Q&A and then my colleagues can help point that out. But that would be helpful as well, just to have a quick response from Victoria at the Bevan Foundation to these findings and what this means for the kind of the policy and political landscape in Wales. So I'll just hand over to Victoria, and please do get thinking of your questions in the meantime, or you'll just have to hear Victoria and I ask each other questions.
Thanks very much, Chris, and thanks also to the team at JRF for a really impressive report and a whistle-stop tour of some of the key findings. Overall, the report is, I think, an absolutely vital reminder of the scale and impact of poverty in Wales. These are not just statistics, these are people's lives who are being shortened, people who are going without food and heating, right here in every single community in Wales. From the presentation and the report, I think there are 3 key takeaways. The first one is about the depth of poverty. Many of us here will be used to talking about incomes below 60% of the median, but that's only part of the story. We are now looking at people whose incomes are not only just 50%, but 40% below the median. That is clear, very close to destitution levels of poverty. And the gap between even the poverty level and the incomes that people are living on is huge and growing. And that is probably the biggest and most powerful message from the presentation. I think the second big takeaway for me is around the huge risks of poverty faced by some groups, children, minority ethnic groups, and disabled people in particular. Those groups are living with levels of poverty that are even more unacceptable, if that's possible, than the headline rates. And I think the other thing that the report does is it explains the complexity between the root causes of poverty. Yes, it's about jobs, but it's not just jobs. Yes, it's about health, but it's not just health. Yes, it's about housing, but it's not just housing. And those factors together interplay to create the state of poverty that we have in Wales today. In terms of solutions, which I hope we'll spend a bit of time talking about in the rest of this webinar, to use the popular political jargon today of a fix, my conclusion is that there is no quick fix for poverty in Wales or indeed in the rest of the UK. Part of the responsibility rests with the UK government. There absolutely has to be a fairer and more equitable social security system that guarantees people are able to afford the essentials. But there is also much that the Welsh Government can and indeed should do. It's Welsh benefits that complement the UK social security system need to be uprated as far as they can go. We need decent housing for all, particularly more social housing, and we need an economy for people who can work and gives a decent reward to work. That's enough from me. I think what the JRF report does is provide a platform and a resource as we go into the next Senedd elections for beginning to sketch out a commitment to ending poverty in Wales for everybody. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Victoria. That's really helpful. And just while people are cooking up their questions for us, Victoria, I don't know if this would be for you or for Stefan, but it's not like the Welsh government don't consider poverty to be an issue in Wales, and it's not that they're not taking any action, but it'd be useful to just reflect on the things which you think are working well in Wales at the moment, or which could be accelerated or done at greater scale. I mean, this is something we see across the UK. We see it a lot in Scotland as well, of a government kind of being in the right place, but just kind of not turning the dial hard enough. Where are those kind of areas in Wales just now?
If I could kick off, I think the Welsh Government has talked the right talk for quite a long time. And I think in some areas has done the right thing. I think the expansion of the discretionary assistance fund, for example, has made a huge difference to those people in the deepest of poverty. But some of the other areas where they have begun to do the right thing, take the right steps, has been such an uphill struggle. For example, to get free school meals in primary schools, we still don't have. We only have free school meals for the very, very poorest children in secondary schools. Getting the uprating of educational maintenance allowance, it's been such a challenge. I think on housing, it's only in the last Senedd government's term that we've had a commitment to building more social homes, and even then it's not delivering. So there's a gap, I think, between the rhetoric of wanting to do something and actually delivering it on the ground. I think Stefan may have a little more to say on housing and childcare.
Yeah, thanks, Victoria. I guess there's also a part of it is, as we discussed, about way some of this is measured as well. So, for example, the areas where they've taken positive action around free school meals won't be taken into account in the data because that isn't measured, and areas where there's the more direct impact is possibly where the action of Welsh Government has been less significant. So childcare in particular, where Wales is lagging behind other parts of the UK in terms of the availability of funded childcare. If we think back to the start of the presentation, where we're hearing about higher rates of child poverty among those families with younger children, in part due to parents leaving the workforce, there is action there that could be taken that would have a direct impact on poverty rates potentially, not just in terms of making people's lives better as well. So I think there are areas like that where more concerted action could deliver kind of a real change.
Thank you both. And we've got a really interesting question from Venice Fielding, which says, we've talked about a culture of low expectations about what can be changed. How could that be shifted, and who might have influence to help do that? I'll have a first go answering that, if I may, and then Victoria and Stefan, please do throw something at me if you'd like to come in too, because I do think this is a massive challenge for the kind of anti-poverty sector across the UK, not just in Wales. But I do think there are particular challenges in Wales. I mean, I wrote a thing recently in the Scottish context, which talked about the kind of change in politics. I mean, across the UK, it used to be, I think, a defensible political strategy to protect the status quo. It's just to say, look, we'll just leave everything as it is, it'll be fine. And I think voters across the UK are telling folk that that is no longer a viable political strategy. If you just defend where we are now, you are likely to lose, and lose in big numbers. And I think that can go one of two ways. That can take us down a fairly dark path where differences are driven between communities and people, or we can take that into a more positive future where we don't see levels of child poverty that are eye-watering. 1 in 3 children in poverty is shocking. Decisions taken, like the UK government's decisions to cut disability benefits, which will have massive impacts. I mean, we've seen a reverse of decisions around the winter fuel payment this week. But these are in the hundreds of pounds. Don't get me wrong, that's important to pensioners who are struggling. But we're talking thousands of pounds a year in disability cuts. And as my colleagues have pointed out, already really high levels of poverty. So I think a crucial message is to get across to decision makers, to politicians, that the status quo cannot stand. And if you stand on it, you are likely to lose. And I think we have to push a message which says to politicians, you have left folk behind for too long. You need to make a difference to the things that matter in their lives. The level, the affordability, the quality of their housing, availability of social care, childcare, quality of education, all these things that matter, what the bills are, how you get help for support in paying those bills. So I think Venice's question is really crucial and a challenge to us all. And just very briefly, we've done a bit of research recently in Scotland. Some of you might remember the Talking About Poverty research, which JRF did a few years ago. We've kind of repeated that in Scotland to look at the kind of messages which might be helpful in turning the dial a bit. And it's really interesting how the tone has changed. The tone has changed to people feeling left behind, to feeling overlooked by politicians, and by trust in politics failing because of that. And the thing that we as a collective sector have to try and change is people's belief that politicians will deliver on that. And that's obviously down to politicians to do it. And the best way for them to do that is significant policy change, which impacts directly on people's lives. I'm going to get off my soapbox now. I don't know, Victoria or Stefan, if there's anything you would add to that.
I've got my soapbox out now, thanks, Chris, and you gave me time to think about it too. So I think you're absolutely right to say the key thing is actions that make a difference. They actually don't need to be particularly complicated. They definitely don't need strategies and documents that take years to produce, whether those are UK child poverty strategies or Welsh Government child poverty strategies. What we do need to, what people want to see is that kind of practical, measurable difference that they feel in their pockets. And we've actually had for too long very high level claims and lots of rhetoric without the action that follows it. And I think one of the key things is that poverty is now so widespread in Wales that it's not over there. It's not something that is experienced by people in the valleys or in a particular part of a city or in a particular rural community. Poverty is actually everywhere. There's no part of Wales where we don't have less than around one in five, 1 in 6 children in poverty. It's here, it's now, and it's what people are experiencing every day. So that recognition by politicians that it should be centre of their actions, and that if they can start to solve poverty, they'll actually start to reduce health inequalities and educational inequalities, I think is fundamental. Off my soapbox.
Yeah, thank you. It's maybe worth just me perhaps stating some of the blatantly obvious, but the areas where the UK government, as the kind of government for the whole of the UK, need to take action, particularly within the social security system, as I alluded to in my previous answer. I mean, we think the cuts to disability benefits are really an outrageous attack on disabled people directly, and not just the potential changes to PIP, which I think. I mean, I would really encourage if there's anyone who's listening to this who might have to be involved in decision making around some of this, sit down and look at the questions which are posed to people to get PIP and to get the scores of 2 and 4, and look at some of the criteria where you would score 2. It's very easy to add them together and see a level of support that people would need. How the UK government can countenance making those changes is beyond me. And the health elements of universal credit as well, that is directly targeted at low-income disabled people and will create deep hardship. That obviously has to end. And then things like loads of people, I'm sure watching this, have been campaigning on for years. The 2-child limit is a cruel, pointless, and poverty-causing poverty, which deserves the history books as quickly as possible. And not to mention just the general inadequacy of universal credit. Universal credit leaves people destitute, particularly single people. And we see, you see this play out in food bank statistics and in homelessness levels, etc. I think it is fine for the UK government to point the finger at devolved government sometimes, for them to take action, and of course they do. But the UK government have a massive role to play in poverty levels across the UK, and really they need to hold up their end of the bargain. And maybe things like reversing on winter fuel payment. Recent changes were announced to free school meals in England. Maybe that will start to see a bit of movement here, but they've got a long way to go. I've just seen the question here from Yvonne about social care. It's something we're interested in as because we've argued for a long time. Childcare is clearly part of the solution to child poverty. Getting kids good quality early learning and childcare is good for the kids as well as for parents if it's affordable, because it unlocks the labour market for them, particularly for women. Social care can be the same for disabled people. I don't know, Stefan, Victoria, is there anything within the social care setting, particularly in Wales, that you think it'd be good to highlight?
I think social care is probably a neglected area in terms of policy and what can be done in social care to help reduce the impact of poverty. I think the point in the question about taking a preventative approach is absolutely key. And yet we know that most local authorities are really, really stretched in terms of their provision of social care. I know Stefan's had some engagement with some of the social care services in parts of Wales where we've talked with them about their preventative work. So I'm going to kick this one over to him.
Yes, I think one thing that's emerging. So there's some work being launched by Oxfam Cymru and others on Thursday, actually looking at care workers and etc. in Wales. And one of the things that actually come through that you'd be thinking is that there are some commitments from the Welsh Government around terms and conditions for the workforce in the social care workforce that they're trying to work towards real living wage within the sector. But those commitments aren't there in the childcare sector. And you can see these kind of different approaches to different bits of the care sector, which actually creates the risk of creating, we know that there's a workforce issue within those sectors. And if you don't take a care view as a whole, you risk moving staff from one bit of the care sector to other bits of it. So that's just an example, I think, of where that kind of the neglection to looking at this with a poverty lens is having an impact possibly in terms of the quality of the services that are being delivered at the moment. So that's one example I think that's coming out this week, kind of that teases out some of those challenges, perhaps.
Thank you. And I do think that the point Yvonne makes in the question and you both made around prevention is so crucial. And I think we often get our knickers in a bit of a twist around prevention being some sort of highly innovative, out there solutions. It's really not. It is about getting further up the river of problems. I mean, I think things like social housing are excellent preventive policy because giving people a secure, affordable base from which to build their life is absolutely crucial. The social security system is a preventative policy as well because it stops people falling so far from a reasonable income that all the knock-on problems that we've talked about. Just to pivot slightly though, Roger Seddon has asked a really important question is how can we identify local solutions that can be translated into national application? And Roger can put another question if I'm about to misinterpret this, but I interpret this as like solutions at a kind of local community level rather than at kind of devolved government level, because I do think this is important. I think this is an important means of showing a bit of hope in what can feel like a pretty dark landscape at the moment. From Victoria and Stefan's perspective, from what are the kind of chinks of light you see happening in communities across Wales which could show a different future to the one we have today, where poverty is consigned to the past? And Victoria, you're smiling, you've unmuted yourself, so I'll come to you first.
Well, I was actually unmuting because I was thinking about the incredible work that's being done in some communities to change the nature of their local economy so that the economy becomes one where wealth is retained rather than leaking out, and then within that community wealth there is a fairer distribution of income and wealth. I'm going to hand over to Stefan though, because Stefan has actually led on several local studies of poverty that the Bevan Foundation has done, and can point to some of the inspiration that we've had from those.
Yeah, I guess kind of the obvious place, I'm sure some people on the call will have heard people talking about, is some of the stuff that's happening in North Wales, and particularly in Gwynedd and Blaenau Ffestiniog. Unfortunately, earlier this year, Selwyn Williams passed away, who's done a lot of outstanding work kind of in building kind of a different approach to the economy there. But his legacy lives on because there's a depth to that work now that's established with the establishment of Cymru Dolly, etc., in that part of the world. And what they're doing is thinking differently, as Victoria said, about the economy. So we're seeing community-owned tourism businesses, kind of community-owned chip shops, etc., generating income that's going back into the community and plugging gaps. So people might not know that Blaenau Ffestiniog does not have a job centre. That shut down. So the community opened their own equivalent to give people advice and make sure that they get the benefits that they're entitled to. So that's a real active example. And what is great is that work connections are being drawn between other communities, we kind of within Gwynedd especially, but also broader. I know lots of connections being drawn with the Cynon Valley, for example. So there is stuff going on, and kind of supporting those groups to develop, I think, is absolutely fundamental because, yeah, as you said, it can easily become depressing to just focus on what's not working, and seeing these really excellent local examples of where things are being done differently definitely kind of does us all good, I think, to remind ourselves that there is an alternative out there for us as well.
Absolutely. Thank you. And I've heard you both talk passionately about that work, and that's partly why I picked that question, to be honest. Because we need, and communities, so often communities that have been genuinely left behind for years are doing it for themselves. And I don't think, we shouldn't accept state failure. The state needs to hold up its end of the bargain, but the innovation, the drive for people to support their own communities is there, and can be a real signal of hope. So I think we've got time for 2 questions left, and I've got them sitting in front of me. And the first one, I've seen, Victoria, you would like to answer Shonda Williams' question about free school meals and the future of free school meals in Wales. So I'll let you answer that, and we'll come on to the last one.
I think the question that Sean had asked is that the UK government response in England is not enough. I think she used the word inadequate, if I can get the question in front of me. Well, it isn't on its own going to solve poverty. Clearly, the providing more children with a free meal is not going to close that gap. But I think when we're looking at a considerable depth of poverty, having the security of a free meal for children in secondary school who are currently excluded from it because their parents have earnings of over £7,400 a year, which is like barely £100 a week. I think would make a difference. I put an article on the Bevan Foundation website earlier this week saying it really is time for the Welsh Government to do the right thing and extend provision. It would be lovely to have universal free school meals in secondary school, but that comes with a bigger price tag. Whether that tag is justifiable or not is a moot point. But without question, extending a free meal to children whose parents, who one bit of the state says is poor enough to get cash help through universal credit, and then another bit of the state is saying, yeah, but you're not poor enough, I think is totally unacceptable. It isn't the solution, but it's part of a suite of measures that I think would make a difference.
Thank you. And just for the last question, because I think this is a good one to end on, because it pushes some of the challenge back onto ourselves at JRF, and question for Bevan as well. It's from Nestine Richards, and she says, thanks all. Given the lack of progress, do you think that organisations such as Bevan and JRF can do anything differently to push for change? And I think this is a question we should be asking ourselves all the time, really, because when progress is slow, it can be frustrating. And in particular, I do not underestimate the position of privilege which JRF come from, in that we aren't in an annual cycle of funding challenges, which I know many of the organisations across Wales and across the rest of the UK are in. And that endless cycle, while things can feel difficult and not improving, is tough. And it is, on some occasions miraculous that people kind of keep on going. So I do think it puts pressure on organisations like our own. It's not, Bevan are not in the same position as us, as you'd be very clear. But we have to keep looking for different ways. And I do think that project I alluded to that we're doing in Scotland at the moment, where we wanted to, because my theory was, there's a thing done by one of the Scottish polling companies, it's called Understanding Scotland, and they ask the same questions every few months and provide an update on that. And one which consistently comes out to me, which I found interesting, was that, I forget the exact number, it was something like 70 to 80% of people in Scotland do not think that the economy works for them. Now, for some people, that's because they want it to be lower tax and all these things, but I think that just shows you the extent to which there is discontent with the current political and economic setting. And so I think that my theory is, at least, that politicians are behind where people are. People want to see change and it's not being delivered. And that frustration with the status quo is building. And as I said in an answer to an earlier question, we could let that go down a very dark path where walls are driven between people. And we have to stop that. And I think that makes it incumbent on us raising some of that pressure on politicians and giving them the solutions that will make that difference to people feel that their quality of life just hasn't improved very much recently, and that's the thing we have to scrap for. Victoria, we've only got a couple of minutes left, but I don't know if you wanted to reflect on that at all.
I think as I look back over the last 20 years, as I'm coming up to retirement, I think there are 3 lessons that I've learned about what works and what doesn't. And I think there are pointers there for the future. I think the first thing is that the poverty sector lacks clear asks, and that is probably the most effective thing that makes a difference. So we have some people arguing for, I don't know, UBI, other people arguing for N2 child limits, someone else arguing for, as JRF are doing and we are doing, about guaranteeing essentials. And I think that mixed messages makes it easier. Well, I think it's confusing for politicians and it's easier for them to not do anything. I think the second thing I've learned is that sometimes you need to show government how. You need to do some of the heavy lifting for them. You need to get under the bonnet and mess around with the engine in order to help them to do what you want them to do. And then the third thing, which I don't think we have the answer to yet, but I think what we need is, clear action by UK government, action at Welsh government level, but then we also need to point to what local authorities and local level organisations can do that make a difference. I go back to something I said at the beginning. I really don't think there's a quick fix for poverty. I think it needs clear actions and it needs to make a difference. And as Chris has reminded us again, it needs to make a difference to people's pockets.
Thank you so much, Victoria. And that really brings us to the end of our session. I'd like to thank Taha, Scott and Fran so much for their earlier presentation, all the work that has gone into what I hope you agree is a brilliant report, to Victoria and Stefan for their input into that. I should make a special mention of Victoria and the fact that she will be stepping down from Bevan, which she has worked so tirelessly and powerfully with the foundation for so long. Has been a brilliant partner to JRF and a voice for change in Wales. And I'm sure you will not be completely silent, Victoria, but you'll be very much missed. And really thank you to all of you who have attended. We've had over 140, 50 attendees at some times, which is brilliant. Thanks for all your questions. I'm sorry we didn't quite get to all of them. Do reach out to any of us within JRF. All our email addresses are on the website if you've got any questions about the report, about anything else that's happening in any of our work across the UK. And I'm sure you will hear from us again in the run up to the Senate elections next year. It's a big year for Wales, as it is in Scotland as well. These are exciting times. These are difficult times in many ways, but we wouldn't keep going if we didn't believe we're a better Wales, a better UK is possible, one that's free from poverty. And we look forward to working with you all to deliver on that. Thank you very much and have a great rest of your day.